2023 quarantine history. Hope you're all doing well. Hope this is working out for you. Shout out real quick to Remy. Sent me a nice email. Said he appreciated me doing this. You know, when I started teaching, I was never a huge fan of speaking in front of crowds. And it was one of the things I probably worried about the most. I have to tell you real quick, speaking in front of nobody is way worse. But that's the situation we're in. A lot of things to kind of get done. Don't want to waste your time, so I just want to just get to them today. When we left here last time, we had ended the war 1812, the Battle of New Orleans. I'm supposing at this point that you have Johnny Horton's Battle of New Orleans, at least, if not in your iTunes, stuck in your head forever. We know we don't win the war, and regardless, you get a sense of nationalism for the first time. People here in the United States feel as though they've won because they didn't lose. And so I talked real quick about this era of good feelings. After the war, 1812 is going to last for about 15 to 18 years or so. Quickly, you know, when Rose's going to become president, not a whole ton of things happen that are of astronomical significance, but we do start to shape America like it's shaped today, and that's kind of helped by two things. We were going to sign what's called the Rush-Bagot Treaty. Give me a second. Rush-Bagot Treaty in 1817. Essentially, it's going to be an agreement between the United States and British Canada to share the Great Lakes and share fishing rights. It's going to limit the number of war vessels that are allowed by each country on those lakes. And in 1818, at the Convention of 1818, the United States and Canada is going to agree to set a border between Canada and the United States at the 49th parallel, which doesn't seem like a huge deal now. The 49th parallel is the northern border of the United States today. But what I think is significant, and when I normally would have in class, you know, it's like if you have a neighbor and you don't have a fence line, and your dog's going to the bathroom in their yard, or your pool's too close to their property, and you know, when there's no defined line between you and your neighbor, ultimately there's going to be issues. And so the nice thing about the 49th parallel being established and the sharing of the Great Lakes being established is that, for all intents and purposes, you really won't have very many problems with the British anymore, at least in British Canada. My yard is here, it goes to there, here's the line, your yard starts over there. And so ultimately, that is going to eliminate a lot of problems. And then we're going to solve the problem. I guess you can call it solve the problem. The southern border of the United States. You know, it's like the what were the movies with I gotta think. Give me a second. Austin Powers. Like from the movie Austin Powers, there's a scene, if you've never seen it, about the British spy. It's goofy, but the guy has the giant mole on his lip. In a lot of ways, Florida is like that. Might have been a girl. I can't remember. I have to look that up too. Florida's kind of that way for the United States. You know, it's completely surrounded by the United States. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Additionally, the other problem with Florida is the fact that Florida gives slaves in places like Georgia and what will become Mississippi and Alabama, Florida gives slaves a place to escape to. Slaves who escape into Florida and eventually meet, Seminole Indians there. Those Seminole Indians will accept those slaves and assimilate them, and Florida ultimately becomes a pretty big problem for the United States. On top of that, the Seminole Indians in Florida are known for raiding white settlements close to the Spanish-American border there. And so if you really, really wanted Florida to be secure and to prevent anyone coming from Florida into the United States and to keep slaves from going into Florida, there's only one person you could probably potentially send there that could accomplish such a job, and that person is Andrew freaking Jackson. So Andrew Jackson, after the Battle of New Orleans, is going to be put in charge of all armies in the southern United States. Most of the time he'll work from his house, his home, his plantation in Tennessee. Monroe is going to ask Andrew Jackson to go to the Spanish-American border and protect it, and to prevent prevent the raids, prevent the escaping the slaves. I usually have a lot of fun with this in class. Because at this point Andrew Jackson for us is starting to get a reputation. And so, and I had this funny sense of humor where, I can see James Monroe telling Andrew Jackson, hey Andy, listen, I need you to go down to the Spanish border and make sure that these raids stop and that no more slaves escape. And Andrew Jackson kind of looking at James Monroe and saying, so you want me to invade Florida? No, Andy, that's not what I said. I need you to go down there and protect the border. So you want me to take the whole thing? No, Andy, I don't need you to take the whole thing. I just need you to go down and make sure that no one's slaves are escaping and that these raids stop. So all of it. And essentially that's what Andrew Jackson does. Andrew Jackson in a sense to secure the border, and he gets bored and he's going to invade Florida. He actually is ordered to terminate the conflict there, and he insinuates multiple times that all you need to do is ask. And at one point he even tells Monroe that if he wants Florida, he can have it, and it will only take Andrew Jackson 60 days to get it. And ultimately he gets bored, he gets into some scuffs with some Indian tribes, and he decides he's had enough. He's going to march into Florida without orders. What you get is the start of the first Seminole Wars. He will actually capture 2 British Indian agents who are helping the Seminoles in Florida. He'll hang them both, which is going to Andrew Jackson killing people, which is going to cause a lot of trouble with the British Empire. We just got out of war with them. You're not at war with them now, and yet you're hanging people as spies on an invasion that you decided was fine or convenient for yourself, that wasn't ordered. And you're also going to have a lot of problems with this Spanish Empire. You haven't declared war, but you're invading. And so Andrew Jackson is going to take over a lot of the military posts there. He's going to overthrow the governor. And ultimately, in the end, this is going to lead to what's known as the Adams-Onis Treaty, which, by the way, if you're highlighting or follow along, that's on your test. The 49th parallel thing's on your test too. Getting used to this new teaching format. The Adams-Onis Treaty, which Andrew Jackson, I have to say real fast, Andrew Jackson takes a lot of heat for doing what he does. The people in government are very, very divided. He has a huge supporter in John Quincy Adams when he does this whole thing. just because Florida's should be part of the United States as far as America is concerned, and all the problems you're having with the Seminoles and stuff. Uh, but he gets in a lot of trouble. I mean, people were questioning, he goes to war without Congress declaring war, and so the government's very split on him. He's very controversial. Now, most Americans are thrilled. It's just, another cherry on the top. His legend is growing, but there are people who are pretty upset. He'll actually go on trial in Congress, and he'll begin to hate a guy by the name of Henry Clay, who will come back later, and we really haven't talked about it yet, but him and Henry Clay will start to hate each other's guts. And so that's kind of how that works out. Ultimately, the Adams-Onis Treaty ends. The invasion of the Adams-Onis Treaty gives Florida to the United States. East Florida and claims to West Florida, which will obviously take over in relatively short order. And in return, the United States gives Spain their claims to Texas. And if I can, I'm going to try some new things today when I edit this. When I can, I'll show you some pictures there. Maybe it'll help it make it a little easier. As far as Monroe is concerned, as president, James Monroe is really known for one thing more than anything else, and that is something called the Monroe Doctrine. I know I'm not supposed to take a lot of time, so I'll try to make this brief. And so around 1820, when Monroe is president, the Spanish Empire in the New World is starting to crumble. Now, ultimately, when the Spanish got here, it was very profitable. They took all the gold out of Central and South America. But once all the gold is gone, what is really left? And the answer is there's not too much. I mean, none of those countries today are overly wealthy, other than Venezuela, and that's because of oil, which wouldn't have been a resource we would have really used back then anyways. But a lot of those Spanish colonies in Central and South America are starting to fall apart. And a lot of those places are rebelling and starting their own governments, and they're doing that with the help of the United States very secretly. If you go back to Lewis and Clark, one of the reasons that the Spanish attempted to go find Lewis and Clark and stop them on their trip was because they were worried they were spying on them. And in matter of fact, Zebulon Pike was, and he was arrested. But the Spanish Empire is crumbling at this point, and the United States is helping them. The United States is starting to worry, though. One thing we cover a lot in class, new countries are weak, right? And all these new countries that were helping get their independence, they're very, very vulnerable to other European countries coming in and recolonizing them. And so this Monroe Doctrine is actually an idea, it's Secretary of State John Quincy Adams' idea, but the United States in 1823 is going to warn all European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Ultimately, you're basically telling the world that the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, from this point forward is going to be the property or the influence of the United States of America. In other words, if you mess around here in the Western Hemisphere, you're ultimately going to be messing with the United States. It's interesting. The United States, after the war 1812, it defends itself. It's starting to grow pretty quickly. It's expanding in size. It's starting to actually play a role in world politics. And by issuing the Monroe Doctrine, it's sending a message to the rest of Europe that, as far as we're concerned, we are and will be at least as powerful as you are. And so the United States is establishing this sphere of influence here in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine still exists today. I mean, if you mess with Mexico, or if you mess with Canada, or you're messing with America. When the Russians tried putting troops in Cuba in the 1960s, and you have the Russian missile, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Those are all like Monroe Doctrine kind of things. One of the scary things today is with Venezuela and all the problems in Venezuela and the government there and the dictator, and supposedly that the Russians are helping, and it's a big concern for the United States. We don't want other foreign powers in this hemisphere. We want to be the major player there. Hey, real quick, if you're paying attention, you know, I told you to print notes, but if you can, at least you can get a piece of paper out. You know, you could write down the 49th parallel for the day because it's a multiple choice question. You could write down the Adams-Onis Treaty. I have on there, one of the completion questions is, what is the Monroe Doctrine? This is the answer. This is the answer. This is the answer I would prefer, right? It was a warning to European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Like I said, it's still in effect today. I just thought it's 200 years old. No. His presidency is 200 years old. It's almost 200 years old. But it's a warning. Stay out. It's the United States' turf. If you mess with anyone here, you're messing with the United States. That's all I basically have for you today. We're going to do some Indian stuff here moving forward, and we're going to have some things to read, but we'll get to that. Day 3, quarantine history. Stay safe. Hope you're all doing well. I don't know why this one seemed like it was a little rougher than the first 2 days, but we'll work on it. See you tomorrow.
We will get by. We will survive.